16th century England, a country caught in a web of social and economic upheaval. Battles with its European neighbors, religious clashes at home, and the dual curse of unemployment and unbridled population growth persuade the country's leaders to look beyond their borders, to the wealth that foreign lands might hold.
Spain was the #1 power in Europe. It derived much of its power from the wealth that it extracted from the Americas in gold and silver, which paid for the expansion of the Spanish Navy and paid for the largest army in Europe. Now, of course, this was very alarming to other Europeans who didn't want to get absorbed into the Spanish Empire. And among the people that it alarmed were the English.
So England, spurred on by the Reformation, by the sense that they were the great leaders of the Protestant cause, wanted to, or at least the leaders of England wanted to see England take its place as a nation rivaling Spain, and they thought the way to do that was through an American presence.
But given their economic plight, how could England expect to compete for lands in North America?
So the English were a relatively small, weak, and relatively poor country when we compare it to Spain in the 16th century. But they benefited from having some quite resourceful leadership and from having, in particular, some very resourceful shipbuilders and sea captains. And they set out to take advantage of their assets to try to weaken the Spanish Empire, which meant, by engaging in piracy, to plunder Spanish seaports in the Americas and to seize Spanish ships in the high seas.
Not too many years earlier, the French launched a similar effort when they established a pirate base along the east coast of Florida.
Now, this was a great location because it's right along the Gulf Stream and it's along the main route of Spanish shipping that's coming out of Havana in Cuba. And it's really the presence of this French pirate base that inspires the Spanish to permanently occupy Florida as a preemptive operation to try to keep other Europeans out. So the Spanish sent an expedition under Menendez which wiped out the French settlement. And then they replaced it with their own nearby fortified settlement, which had become St. Augustine, Florida, which is the oldest permanent European settlement within the bounds of the United States. Now, the other place that the French went was much farther to the north, and this was into the St. Lawrence Valley of Canada and along the coast of the maritime provinces. It's a lot farther away from Spanish power, which is down in the Caribbean. And the French found that the native peoples of Acadia and of Canada were willing to trade with them, which meant that the French relationship with the Indians starts out in a very different manner than the Spanish relationship with the native peoples of the Caribbean or of Mexico.
The French were beginning to establish in the St. Lawrence. That is, a connection to a lucrative fur trade that was run by the Indians. All of the connections were made by Indians. In fact, the first initiative in setting up the trade, the Indians approached the French, not the other way around. And that required very little in the way of capital investment. You go to America, you pick up your product, you offer the trade goods in exchange, and then you take it back to Europe.
By now, another sea power, the Dutch, also joins the race for territory and riches.
And the Dutch were a relatively small and a relatively recent country, established by a revolution against Spanish rule. They achieved their independence, and then they had a remarkable growth in power as they figured out that their way to get rich was to get more of the world's commerce, and that the way to do it was to take it away from the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so they established a presence in what's now Indonesia. They founded a settlement in Cape Town at the tip of South Africa. And in the course of building this empire, they also picked up their colony along the Atlantic seaboard that they call New Netherlands. So the important thing to bear in mind is that the New Netherlands was then a relatively small and not particularly prosperous part of this overstretched empire.
With multiple nations already vying for a foothold in North America, England enters the fray.
Here was this land, and everybody wanted to claim it, and one of the things you wanted to do was to defame other people who had claims. The English in particular, in order to morally justify their incursions into the Western Hemisphere, and of course they didn't really need a moral justification to do so, they ran the Spaniards down. And so out of this came what we call the Black Legend of Spanish conquest, as a way of saying the Spanish have forfeited their moral right to these lands, therefore we, the English, and of course the French in a similar fashion, said we have a right to go there. And point of fact, what you had were a group of imperialistic powers simply saying, we want to grab off as much as we can.
Queen Elizabeth's way of operating was essentially to put resources into the hands of people who could carry out national policies, so that Raleigh actually received a great deal of wealth, indirect and direct, as a result of royal largesse. I think to some extent with the understanding that this would be used to foster overseas enterprises like colonization.
Initially, Sir Walter Raleigh chooses Roanoke, low-lying land on the Virginia coast, as his base of operations.
Roanoke had one great asset, which is that it was within a set of treacherous sandbanks, which meant that enemy ships of the Spanish would be very reluctant to go anywhere near it, and so probably wouldn't find this pirate base. But if it's a hard place for enemy ships to get to, it's also a hard place for your own ships to get to, which meant that ships bringing reinforcements or supplies, their sea captains didn't like to go to Roanoke, and often just sailed away from it, which meant that the colonists there felt that they had been abandoned.
Roanoke was a terrible place to put a colony because it's not very productive land. It's basically sand, has very, very limited water supply, and you're really dependent on rainwater. And it was chosen for the wrong reasons. It was chosen in order to aid privateering.
The people who'd been established there initially were military men, and they didn't want to raise crops. They wanted Indians to feed them, just as Indians fed the Spanish conquistadors, which meant that this English presence developed a hostile relationship with the Indians, who didn't see any reason why they should be feeding these unwanted guests.
Well, the first people to go in every instance, both in the late 16th and in the early 17th century, were groups of young men, either soldiers or people who were of the right age and type to be soldiers. One of the things that's, I think, remarkable about Raleigh is that he realized that that wasn't the appropriate model and scrapped it, and in the second attempt to found a colony at Roanoke, he sent entire families. And that was a lesson that the Virginia Company then had to learn over again.
91 men, 17 women, and 9 children set sail for Roanoke in 1587 to establish the family-centered colony Raleigh envisioned. The commander of the expedition, John White, returns to England for supplies and more families. He plans to return to Roanoke in a few months' time, but it was actually 3 years before he could get back.
We let fall our grapnel near the shore and sounded with a trumpet a call, and afterwards many familiar English tunes of songs, and called to them, friendly, but we had no answer. At my departure from them in 1587, I will them that if they should happen to be distressed in any of those places, that they then should carve over the letters or name a cross in this form. But we found no such sign of distress. We passed toward the place where they were left in sundry houses, but we found the houses taken down, and the place very strongly enclosed with a high palisade of great trees, very fort-like. And one of the posts at the right side of the entrance had the bark taken off, and 5 foot from the ground in capital letters was graven C-R-O-A-T-O-A-N, without any cross of sign of distress. From thence we went along by the waterside toward the point of the creek to see if we could find any of their boats, but we could perceive no signs of them. Presently Captain Cook and I went to the place which was in the end of an old trench, where we found 5 chests that had been carefully hidden of the planters, and of the same chests 3 were my own, and about the place many of my things, spoiled and broken. This could be no other but the deed of the savages, who had watched the departure of our men, and as soon as they were departed, digged up every place where they suspected anything to be buried. When we had seen in this place so much as we could, we returned to our boats and departed from the shore towards our ships with as much speed as we could.
There is not a trace of the families White had left on Roanoke Island.
And to this day, we're not certain what became of them. A return expedition that went to look for them found no signs of violence, so it doesn't seem that they were wiped out in an Indian attack, but it may be that they went a little to the north and lived among Indians in the Chesapeake Bay region. But what ultimately became of these people, we still do not know.
Did the Roanoke colony have a chance of succeeding?
And I think there was every prospect for Roanoke to have been a successful colony. The reason why it failed ultimately was because England got involved in a war with Spain. The fleet that Raleigh at least says he had gathered to go to Roanoke with fresh colonists and fresh supplies was diverted to the defense needs of the nation. And then following that, there was a prolonged war until the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign in 1603. Roanoke isn't so much, I think, a failure on the American side, it's a failure on the English side.
England is finding, as other countries, that establishing a presence in North America has its challenges.
One major change going at the beginning of the 17th century is that London is starting to get interested in overseas colonies, and that means that London merchants are willing to invest in it. And that by now they have invented something very close to the modern corporation, where you can buy shares, pool the resources of a lot of different people, and the Virginia Company Charter of 1606 is the first major example of that. They do raise an enormous amount of money, several £100,000 in 20 years' time, and they do just barely manage to get a colony which survives all of the trials of those first couple of decades.
What we think of as colonization is incredibly expensive, and England was poor enough that all such enterprises had to be done by private enterprise. So I think what they were hoping for was a trading post, or a post for privateering and other kinds of activities. It's what the French were beginning to establish in the St. Lawrence. Colonization was something that they went into when they found that there was no other way to have an American presence and make it pay. And I think they did it reluctantly.
The London Company's second colony is established at Jamestown, an inland location they think will be easier to defend.
If you were to look at the very early phase of migration, the migration to the Chesapeake, there are some people whom John Smith, for instance, called adventurers and footmen, guys with and I do mean guys, with an eye on the main chance. People who wanted to make a quick kind of buck, get in and out. With any luck, they would be able to find gold or some other kind of immediately extractable substance.
Some of the leading colonists were the youngest sons of gentry and nobility families who wanted to secure wealth and status in a new world, which they were not going to get in the old world because that was going to go to their older brothers.
And you can see in Jamestown, they spend the first decade trying to get by without sending large numbers of people. And then it's only when that clearly has failed that there's no treasure immediately to be picked up. I mean, you can't sell enough sarsaparilla or sassafras to make this kind of connection pay, that they began to think in terms of setting up true communities or colonies of people in America from the old world.
The London Company, now calling itself the Virginia Company, obtains a new charter in 1609 and offers incentives to anyone willing to migrate. 600 people, among them women and children, depart for Virginia in the spring.
Many of the colonists were indentured servants who couldn't pay their way across the Atlantic, who entered service for a period of several years in order to pay their way in the hope of attaining some kind of economic security. Some of the original settlers had no real intentions of staying in the New World in the South. They hoped that they would either get rich or at least secure a competency and then go back.
So about a quarter of the people in the 17th century who go to the Chesapeake went as free people who paid their own way. 3/4 went as indentured servants. These were the people who were in the greatest demand because the people who owned farms and plantations in the Chesapeake could get more work out of them.
The assumption was that because this was primarily an economic enterprise, that male workers would be preferable to female workers, and so the gender ratio was very skewed at first, 6 men for every 1 woman.
Also, these would be the people who would be more willing to take the risk, the considerable risk of going across the Atlantic and living in this new colony, a gamble that a lot of them lost. We could say that before 1650, most of them lost. They didn't live long enough to become free.
There's a letter by a man named John Freethorn who was sent by his parents as a servant to Virginia, which has been preserved in the Virginia Company records, in which he essentially says, if you had known what you were sending me into, you would not have sent me here. Sort of basically, get me out of here. He says, you have turned away a beggar at your door with more than I get in a week to eat here.
The South was a death trap. I mean, people were dropping like flies during the first few years. And at one point, things got so bad, both from the point of view of disease and from the point of view of their suffering from malaria and other diseases, that one winter over half of the colonists died. And there is some evidence to suggest that people were digging up corpses and eating them, and things got pretty bad.
Within 10 days, scarce 10 among us could either go or well stand. Such extreme weakness and sickness oppressed us. And thereat none need marvel, if they consider the cause and the reason, which was this. While the ships stayed, our allowance was somewhat bettered by a daily proportion of biscuit, which the sailors would pilfer to sell, give, or exchange with us for money, sassafras, furs, or love. But when they departed, our president allowed equally to be distributed 1/2 pint of wheat and as much barley boiled with water for a man a day, and this having fried some 26 weeks in the ship's hold, contained as many worms as grains. But now was all our provisions spent, the sturgeon gone, all helps abandoned, each hour expecting the fury of the savages, when God, the patron of all good endeavors, in that desperate extremity so changed the hearts of the savages, that they brought such plenty of their fruits and provision as no man wanted.
In the early going at Jamestown, in the Jamestown settlement, it is clear, I think, that the European settlers in Jamestown would not have made it through the winters they did were it not for the example of Indians' own agriculture and gifts of food from Indians.
Corn, in particular, is considered a miracle crop.
And the way the natives grew it, planting beans and having the beans then use the corn stalks for support, was extremely productive because the beans actually put nitrogen into the soil so that they were fertilizing the corn through this device. And English cultivators who thought that that looked sloppy and who grew the corn in this field and the beans in this field could never figure out why their yield was so much lower than the Indians' yield.
As volatile as their relationship often was, why were Native Americans so supportive?
There's no question that they could have halted colonization in the early years. And without that Indian help, they would never have been able to establish themselves, even in the limited way that they did. So why did the Indians extend this aid? And the answer seems to be that the Indian leaders who were nearest the settlements, that is, Wingina in Roanoke and Powhatan in Virginia, understood that if they could become the conduits for European goods into the interior, that that would enhance their power.
Edmund Morgan a long time ago wrote an article entitled something like The Paradox of Jamestown. In the provocations leading up to and then following the 1622 massacre, Jamestown settlers literally bit or killed the hands that were feeding them. They attacked the Indians, they burned the cornfields, and they left themselves in a state of real desperation. So part of what Morgan asked was, why would people behave in such an obviously self-destructive and counterproductive way? A large part of his answer was that one thing that the Europeans really counted on heavily and that they held dear was a sense of cultural superiority, that they were civilized, they were Christian, they would be the benevolent patrons of the area around them. And the circumstances in which they found themselves were not ones that would make you feel that everything was going well. And the investors were putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the people in Jamestown to start producing profits. So these settlers find themselves dying off. Things aren't going their way, and it turns out that their much vaunted superiority over the Indians is also not being borne out, and that part of their response was a kind of cultural retribution.
Once again, England and its Virginia Company surrogate find it necessary to re-examine their approach to colonization.
The authorities soon realized that not having women around meant that they didn't have stable family households, which during this period was seen as very much a guarantor of social order. There was very little social order in the early South, and so they started to encourage women to come across in larger and larger numbers.
The person who first saw this most clearly, I think, was Captain John Smith, not the person that we usually credit with being the great theorist of colonization. But he's the one who says, absolutely, if you want colonies to succeed, you've got to give people incentives for coming. You have to give them control over their own lives and their land. You have to give it to them and their heirs in perpetuity. And then people will come. The other point that he makes over and over again is that you have to be prepared to found your colony on humble commodities that will be produced by old world people in America. He says that colonies run by aristocrats do not work. What you need is merchants to run things, because merchants understand the realities of how things are done. You need to have these enterprises divided up so that the people who are working in them all have a stake in them.
What they needed to do was to develop agriculture, to support themselves, feed themselves, and then to develop some sort of crop that they could market in Europe. But it took them quite a while to figure that out, essentially a decade in which hundreds of English people went to Jamestown and its vicinity, and most of them died within a very few years. Some from conflict with the Indians, but mostly from disease and from malnutrition, because they weren't raising enough to feed themselves. And it's really only in the 16 teens that they succeed in raising enough food to feed themselves, in the form primarily of corn and of pigs. And they raise tobacco, which they discover is a crop that will thrive in the hot and humid summers of the Chesapeake, and a crop that had quite a high value in Europe.
And that, too, is ironic, because at the very beginning they didn't really want to grow tobacco. That required work, which they were not always so thrilled with. And the company and the crown didn't particularly approve of the planting of tobacco. They wanted these guys who worked for them to do other things. And James I wrote a tract against tobacco, condemning tobacco, the stinking weed, or whatever he called it. So, ironically, the one thing that turned out to be extremely successful, even that they didn't take advantage of it at the very beginning.
If you start Virginia history in about 1619, the Virginia Company was reorganized at that point. The headright system is instituted so that people are given land in exchange for funding servants coming over for periods of servitude, after which they will be free then to also set up for themselves. English people began to understand how it has to be done, if it's to be done at all.
Colonists are granted the full rights of Englishmen, and even a share in self-government. The House of Burgesses, a forum of elected representatives, meets for the first time in the summer of 1619. But despite these efforts, James I revokes the Virginia Company's charter in 1624, and Virginia becomes a royal colony.
That actually made things better for the people who lived in the colony. Some of the financial pressures eased off a bit, and by then they were beginning to reap the benefits of the tobacco crop and some further recruitment. So things actually did get better after that. But as I said, the true stability, you don't see the evidence of really great stability until much later in the century, 1680s, 1690s. It's only at the very turn of the century that the population begins to reproduce itself naturally.
And so the Royal Colony of Virginia, that began as a pirate base in 1585, enters a period of greater stability. The question is no longer the survival of England's North American foothold, but managing the competing forces that will vie for attention as the province expands and grows. The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.